How I found you is that I've been perplexed over this Venezuela situation. So what I did is I just went over to the old YouTube. I typed in Tom Woods Venezuela, and you were the first interview that popped up, and I listened to it, and I'm like, wow, this was great. This was some great background information. So since then, I've been following all of your work. I've been reading all of your articles at Mises. You're doing a great service because I'm pretty ignorant when it comes to Venezuela or pretty much anything South America. Most of my concentrations in the Middle East. So whenever something happens or whenever there's an economic crisis or talk of regime change in a country that's not in the Middle East, I'm pretty behind the curve. Thank you so much for helping me understand this a little bit more, and I think my audience is gonna see this as being really valuable as well.
Yeah, no problem. I'm gonna just say this right now. After I drop this Venezuela ebook, I'm not gonna be writing as on Venezuela as much because I think I've like written everything without like I've written all that needs to be said because if I write any more, I'm gonna be just repeating myself. Um, but I'm gonna be focusing more on state stuff because my specialty right now, because I work as a gun lobbyist, um, is mostly like Second Amendment stuff, like state and local level work. Um, but I think the Venezuela book I'm going to release very soon is going to be very comprehensive and has a lot to offer. But yeah, Venezuela is pretty screwed up, and I don't really see much of a future there. And if the U.S. does intervene, it's going to make it even like much worse. So there's that, and yeah, but yeah, it's even though it's very different from the Middle East, I still see a U.S. intervention there like as a bad idea. So
Yeah, I was surprised. I mean, it just seems to me that I feel like Trump he's more pragmatic about regime change and he sees opportunity in South America as far as implementing some type of regime change or foreign intervention. That's why I feel like he is a lot more hawkish in South America than he is in the Middle East. Um, I mean, basically, I guess the mainstream narrative right now is because of the oil, and Trump wants to capitalize on the oil. I mean, do you think that's true? Do you think that's the main reason why Trump is the White House right now?
I think I think personally, um, there's bigger geopolitics because China and Russia have a strong presence there. China has given Venezuela like $50 billion in loans. Russia has done the same, and a lot of the companies that Venezuela has had to actually privatize has been sold to like Russian state-owned enterprises, or the Russians have like majority stakes in there. And I'm actually of the opinion that if Venezuela wants to stave off um like a major like collapse, like potential civil war, um I think they will have to become like a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese and the Russians for the short term. Like they're gonna have like they're gonna have to do like privatization schemes and sell it off to the Russians and stuff like that because if not, it's just gonna completely implode and turn into like a failed state. It already is, but it's gonna just turn into a war zone. But that's the reason why the U.S. Wants to get in there because they don't want Russia and China in our backyard. That's why they're going after Nicaragua and Cuba as well. The troika of tyranny, as John Bolton called them. Um, I actually don't think they will intervene, at least like militarily, in Venezuela for now, because there's just much bigger fish to fry in the Middle East. The Middle East has insane geopolitical significance. Um, I'd say since like the beginning of civilization, you've had the Persians, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mongols, the Turks, um, the Ottomans. the British, even the Russian in Imperial Russia, and then now the U.S. Like in the 1980s, like a lot of the foreign policy establishment was always thinking ahead and talking about like the Middle East as like the next grand chessboard. So I actually think that they might divert more attention to the Middle East, because I think a lot of this could be just saber rattling. But Venezuela does have really nasty implications, though, for like a potential refugee crisis and all that.
Well, I'm relatively ignorant on Venezuela. Like, I only really know the headlines. Like, the mainstream narrative, or at least the mainstream narrative on the right wing, is that Hugo Chavez took power. He turned the country into a socialist cesspool, and now people are living in extreme poverty, doing things like looting and eating zoo animals. However, I suspect that Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they didn't really spark the genesis of what's going on there. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, in fact, that's where I come in. This conservative analysis is very half baked. Um, in fact, like it ignores the previous 50 years of Venezuelan history where lighter forms of socialism were installed and progressively got bigger and bigger decade after decade. 1958 was kind of the genesis of it, because Venezuela, from 1950 to 1958, was in a dictatorship, but it was actually one of its most stable governments. And in fact, Venezuela became one of the richest countries in that time period. From 1914 to 1958, Venezuela was predominantly under military governments, but they maintained a relatively hands off approach to economic planning and whatnot. So the country went from a backwater to like one of the richest countries, not only in the region, but in the world. And when they returned to democracy in 1958, they had two parties rule Venezuela from 1958 to 1998 that were both like socialist light. And every decade, the government just grew bigger and bigger. And when they nationalized the oil industry in 1975, the country just really started to go downhill. 1980s, they had a mega devaluation of the currency. The country was just shackled by debt. And by the 1990s, they had to like do an IMF restructuring, and huge riots broke out. In fact, the government had to like pull off like a Tiananmen light type of crackdown to quell all this unrest. And 1992, when I was like really young, there were two coups launched by Hugo Chavez, and from that point forward, Venezuela like was institutionally broken. Its bipartisan order fell apart, and in 1998, this is something that a lot of conservatives and a lot of these people don't talk about. Um, the average Venezuelan was actually poorer than in 1958, when it returned, the beginning of its return to democracy. And Hugo Chavez, when he campaigned in 1997, like he had an easy presidential campaign, because he basically like said like, look what these two parties did to your wealth in this period. And he actually campaigned as a relatively free market candidate. He was talking a lot about rent seeking, um, calling out the political class for its corruption. But once he took office, it was just, he not only continued the same stuff that made Venezuela stagnant, but like he doubled down, and it was kind of like that's what all she wrote. But why I think this is important is that socialism is kind of like a not just an economic phenomenon, but like a cultural type of thing where as it becomes more ingrained in an economy, it affects the culture and effectively makes everyone like more socialist or more socialist inclined. So anytime a crisis emerges, it'll be bigger calls for more government, and it becomes kind of like an illness. And why this is important is that the U.S., the opposition that the U.S. is backing right now, they're all socialists. They're actually socialist light. They're like the children of the previous Venezuelan economic order, And if the U.S. has to intervene and they successfully topple Maduro, which is likely, these same people that actually impoverished Venezuela before will just be coming back to power and repeating the same cycle. In fact, I'd argue they could be governing worse because if they don't address like Venezuela's pressing needs of like privatization and stuff like that, they could be deposed easily in a coup or some type of upheaval because the country needs shock therapy, and there's just so much economic damage done by like 50 years of nonstop intervention that it has to have an exorcism. There's just no way around it. And like the cultural damage too. I think that's what's going to prevent the country from recovering quickly anytime soon because all politics flows downstream from culture. When you have a very culturally inclined population that favors socialism, makes it very difficult to move forward. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. But I think the U.S., if they get involved, so many unintended consequences to take into consideration can emerge. So I think Venezuela is very much like in deep doo doo.
Well, how did Venezuela, before they fully embraced socialism, how did they become? What sparked the initial boom period for Venezuela before the Social Democrats were elected to power?
Basically, the 1914 was like the pivotal year because that was the discovery of oil in Lake Maracaibo. And it's true that oil made Venezuela rich, but there's more to the story. From 1914 to 1958, the Venezuelan state was very small. It actually didn't establish a central bank until 1939. The income tax was like I think like less than 35% for the highest earners. Government spending was low. They were able to attract skilled immigration from European countries such as Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So it had a lot of favorable factors. It also wasn't directly hurt by World War II. So Venezuela was positioned to be rich at that time, and it grew from one of Latin America's poorest and most unstable countries to one of the richest countries in the world, where it rivaled like European countries in terms of standard of living. But it was beginning in the 1980s, like a decade after the nationalization of oil industry, that things just started going badly because the nationalization of oil allowed politicians and bureaucrats to control all the oil revenue. And once they captured it, they would just distribute it to their political supporters, their pet corporations, and put it into a bunch of like public infrastructure boondoggles. And like it was just a complete destruction of wealth. And Venezuelans paid for it in the 80s and 90s. They tried free market reforms in the 90s, but the president who ironically nationalized the oil industry in the 70s came back to power in the 90s and was in charge of those reforms. His name is Carlos Andrés Perez. He was impeached by his own party, which is a socialist party, because they feared that his free market reforms would hurt a lot of their government privileges. And from that point forward, Venezuela lost a grand opportunity to actually like institutionally and like economically repair itself. And I think like his impeachment in 1993 or 94, I forget, was kind of like a turning point where Venezuela was not going to embrace any market reforms from that point forward.
So oil wasn't the only reason Venezuela became rich. I think that's a pretty common narrative.
Yeah, it was not the only reason.
They were like investor friendly, capital friendly.
Yeah, in fact, Venezuela was one of the last countries to nationalize its oil industry, like in the 70s. It was actually like a laggard, and that's why a lot of oil companies preferred to do business there because they didn't have to worry about having to deal with the government with regards to contracts and how like the revenues would be split and all that. So they had an advantage there. That's why they became very rich, and that's why Venezuela was relatively democratic too, because states with nationalized oil industries tend to be pretty authoritarian, because when you put the state as like a distributor of wealth, especially when they capture the wealth, it creates a sub a patron and subject relationship, which is completely different from a classical liberal style of governance where people pay taxes to governments to supposedly protect them and defend their rights. Whereas it's like the opposite way around. The people are dependent on government in the petro state. Venezuela avoided that until the 1970s, but after the 1970s, um, it just completely imploded. That's why, like in the 90s, like the country had like so many insurrections, and by the time Hugo Chavez came to power, the country was in pretty bad shape institutionally. It was still relatively rich, but you would tell that something bad was about to happen within 10 years or so.
So they were using oil revenue to subsidize other industries.
Yeah, and it generally failed because the instead of letting the market do that, they let like the petrostate um, pick winners and losers, and more often than not, they subsidize companies that were inefficient or just politically connected and really did not meet consumer demands in Venezuela. That's why even to this day, a lot of members of the opposition they like crony capitalism. When you talk about whole scale privatization, they shudder in fear.
Yeah, can you give me a little bit more background on the decades preceding Hugo Chavez? Like what led you mentioned it before, but what exactly led to him um, becoming essentially the dictator of Venezuela?
Well, in the previous decades, like 1960s and 1970s, Venezuela started engaging in like land reform where they would undermine a lot of property rights that encouraged like a lot of squatting and other unsavory practices. You would see the establishment of rent control and subsidized housing, which created like the infamous rancho, which is like a Venezuelan ghetto. And these interventions laid the basis for this. A lot of people tend to think that socialism happens in like an instant. It doesn't. It can take like years, sometimes decades, for a lot of its negative effects to arise. And then you had the oil nationalization, which is like the most important part, because after that, the government of Carlos Andres Perez in 1973 was thought that like with the state controlling the oil industry, they would have enough money to pay for healthcare, education, all this stuff, and they also partially nationalized their central bank too, where the government had a majority stake in the central bank, so the bank was completely politicized, and as a result, easy money became the norm in Venezuela from the 1970s up until the present. In fact, Venezuelan millennials have never um, witnessed a single year of single digit inflation. Inflation has been at least 10% or higher. Now it's at 60,000% because it's hyperinflation. But I think the last time Venezuela had single digit inflation was in 1983. I wrote about this in an article for Mises. So sound money has almost been like non existent for the past 40 or so years. And by the 1980s, Venezuela had to devalue its currency to the bolivar because of the massive spending of the 1970s. And you started to see the lower classes and the lower middle classes become poorer and restless. And when Carlos Andres Perez came back in the late 1980s, he campaigned under the same premise of the 70s, saying that, oh, I'm going to continue the same spending binges and make Venezuela great again and all this stuff. But he came to the realization once he sat down with advisors that the country was bankrupt, uncompetitive, had like crazy amounts of tariffs, import bans, all this stuff that made it like a very economically uncompetitive market. So the IMF had to come in. They offered some decent reforms such as privatizations and tariff reductions and all of that, but they really didn't go far enough. And in fact, they were never able to tame inflation throughout Pettis' administration, which is what really killed him because a lot of like the people that were suffering saw their savings erode throughout this time whenever inflation was like around 50% per year, which would be like insane if you were living in the West because 50% inflation is almost unheard of.
So what? That's insane. So what did Chavez do that was so radical?
Well, I think the difference between Chavez and the previous eras is like the degree of socialism. You can say that the previous era of Venezuelan politics was like European style socialism. Even then, I think that's a stretch because um, I'd say Venezuela from 1958 to 1998 is actually more socialist than current day Europe. It was pretty leftist. But what Chavez did was he did wholesale expropriations and confiscations of industries because the previous political order, the only industry they really expropriated was the oil industry. Um, Whereas Chavez not only nationalized some aspects of the oil industry, like every other industry from farming to mining to even like pharmacies were subject to government confiscations like any on any day. The level of price controls that were put in place were much higher as well. That's why you see like all the long lines. um he also copied the exchange controls of the previous eras but like doubled down, so it's basically like socialism but on steroids is how you would categorize the Chavez and Maduro regimes. Um, Also, just the fact that there was like a lot of violations of civil liberties because Chavez really did not care for free speech, due process, and they would definitely beat up opposition and jail opposition on arbitrary charges. Um, there were some instances where the Chavez and Maduro administration have had to like privatize certain sectors of the economy to a very limited degree because of like economic realities, but um, there's no free market reforms on the menu as far as the current government goes, and even the opposition. I do not believe they will accomplish much because they're also pretty socialist, and they think that they can go back to like the 90s, 80s, or 70s, which is not going to happen because the country industry is pretty much wrecked. It's so overburdened by regulation and bad economic policy, and the culture is very messed up due to like the decades of socialism that they're going to have to take more of a path, I think, like Chile did um, in the 1970s and 1980s and just liberalize their economy wholesale, or else the country is just going to slip in between like coups, potential military dictatorships, or even like quasi presidential strongman rule, because I think the country is completely in shambles in every socioeconomic and cultural front.
You know what's really funny, and you mentioned that the opposition is, they're socialist as well. You would think that the White House thinks that they practice like Adam Smith capitalism, the way that they support them.
Well, well, that's the thing about foreign policy interventionism. A lot of these people don't even do proper research. I think when you look at Venezuela, it's really not a case about ideology anymore when it comes to the U.S. being interested. They want to get their payments, whatever interest groups want to change in Venezuela. They want to get paid. They want to get like access to the oil, better access to it, and that's all there is to it. But really, it's a geopolitical game because with Russia and China involved in Venezuela, both economically and even like with military logistics too, because they do supply a lot of arms and military equipment to Venezuela. The U.S. is kind of like compelled to step in, at least like the neocons. That's how neocons see it. Like everything is a geopolitical game for them.
I thought they wanted to liberate the people there, based off John Bolton.
Well, that's the pretext, but everybody knows that's everybody that's been aware of the past 20 years of like really messed up geopolitics, or really the past century if you think about it. That's just a ruse to get the military industrial complex up and running and just securing financial interests for American oligarchical groups and
It's kind
whatnot.
of funny though, because they are being Trump and Bolton, they've actually been kind of transparent that they have geopolitical interest in Venezuela. Like when it comes to the Middle East and foreign intervention, pretty much everywhere else, it's always about like somebody gassing their own people or some murderous dictator. Bolton just straight up said, "Hey, yeah, there's oil there. It'd be a good opportunity for American oil companies."
Yeah, they're actually very frank about it with the Venezuelan case. I think like a lot of this is kind of a psyop, to be honest, to see how responsive the American populace is to this. Because if you saw a week ago, Bolton had a notepad where it apparently said like 5,000 troops to Venezuela. I think he did that purposely to kind of conduct like a somewhat of an experiment to see how the public would react to that, because that's actually pretty ambiguous. What are those 5,000 troops going to be there for? Are they there to back up Colombia should Venezuela collapse? Are they there to potentially be a springboard for invasion or some type of Gulf of Tonkin incident where they can justify sending even bigger amounts of military forces? Because the U.S. has actually sent troops to Latin America before, like Panama in the 1980s under Bush the Elder. He sent about like 20,000, over 20,000 troops to Panama, a country much smaller than Venezuela. So that 5,000 troops, I don't know what they're going to be there for, but it doesn't really bode well. And I don't even know if they're going to follow through with it, but they're definitely saber rattling right now.
Sometimes I think John Bolton's entire role in the government in the White House is to be like this scary guy that make you seem like he'll do anything. Like him having a paper, what was it, 6,000 troops he had down? Is that what it was?
Yeah,
Or
5,000 to
5,000?
6,000, I forget. It's somewhere around there, though.
That's just like, I think it adds
Yeah.
to the case that John Bolton's there to like show that you have a gun and you're willing to use it. But as far as like an actual invasion, I mean, I hope there's not an invasion, but I mean, I guess we've we've uh we've yet to see everything play out. But I have a question. So the number one excuse I hear about Venezuela is the oil prices. Is that when the oil goes down, that's what actually destroys their economy. What do you make of those excuses about just their economy being basically a slave to what the oil prices are?
Well, that's actually a good question, Henry, because you see, I actually covered this at the Mises Institute, like the history of oil prices in Venezuela. A lot of people don't realize is that from like 1910 to like the 1950s, Venezuela actually grew at tremendous rates under some of the historically lowest oil prices imaginable, especially in the 1940s and 1950s, and the 1950s and 1960s. Whereas under Chavez, especially like from 2003 to 2012, oil prices were through the roof. And in fact, even when they dropped, they were still at historical highs. So there's much more to the Venezuelan collapse than high oil prices. In fact, the 1970s as well, with such high oil prices, Venezuela is still kind of stagnated in growth. So there's a lot more to this story than just oil prices. That being said, high oil prices benefit more the government because they have just more money to squander and whatnot. But as far as like actual economic growth, like attracting capital, increasing productive capacity, and all of that, you have to have a very institutionally sound environment for that to happen.
Yeah, and isn't the fall of price of one commodity, isn't that just a further indictment of their economic system? Like, how can their economy just be so attached to one single thing?
Yeah, I mean that's the problem, Henry. When you have a very statist economy that's been statist for the past like 60 years, the result is a very uncompetitive economy that has to rely on like one resource, and that resource, unfortunately, is heavily controlled by the state. It's an insanely lucrative resource, oil, but even the best central planners and whatnot cannot make that go on for very long, and eventually it will go bust.
Yeah, and another excuse that I hear a lot, and I hear this a lot from the left, a lot of people are blaming U.S. sanctions on Venezuela's economic problems. I mean, does that hold any validity at all?
Well, Venezuela has suffered several sanctions since the latter years of the Obama administration, but here's the catch: they were only imposed on government officials. You don't have like Cuban or Iranian style sanctions where there's like a practical embargo on the entire economy, especially in the Cuban case. In turn, that just shows that most of the overwhelming portion of this crisis is self-generated. That being said, the recent sanctions that Bolton and them pushed through are a bad sign. I think that in a year or two, if cooler heads don't prevail, there is talk about potential import bans of oil in the United States from Venezuela. I think Mike Pompeo and some other people in Congress have flirted with that idea, and I would not put it past them to do that because that's generally a very strong sign that there's going to be like some big interventionist ramifications. Because right now, I think it's just saber rattling. But if they do like a very large scale sanction or embargo, um, things get pretty nasty.
Yeah, it will remind everyone of Iraq because, of course, the Iraqi sanctions were some of the worst in human history, and they eventually led up to a U.S. invasion in the early 2000s. So I can definitely see that. I saw that you wrote a lot about gun control laws, and you mentioned that you're a Second Amendment lobbyist, right? Am I
Yes,
correct?
correct.
Or
Yes, you are correct, Henry.
so I saw you wrote a piece called "How Gun Control Became an Instrument of Tyranny in Venezuela." So I don't really know much about the gun control laws and how they've affected Latin America and Venezuela. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, in Latin America, there isn't much of a gun culture, meaning that they don't really have rights to bear arms in most Latin American countries in their constitutions. It's mostly treated like a regulated privilege that the military, law enforcement, and other quasi governmental security services can enjoy. But this is a legacy of the Spanish colonial tradition because in those times, only the military, landed nobility, and groups tied to the Spanish crown could carry firearms, and it's carried over into present day Latin America. A lot of cultural and political habits die hard. That's why, like the U.S., on the other hand, which has a strong militia tradition that dates back actually to like the 1650s in England and was transplanted to the U.S., has a very robust civilian gun ownership tradition. And so you see, like in the 1930s, a lot of Venezuela's modern gun control laws were passed then, which essentially made only like the possession of like a 22 rifle available to like the average citizen, but other firearms like shotguns, pistols, what have you had to be like military law enforcement or have to go through insane amounts of bureaucratic hoops just to do that. And this stuff was actually expanded upon during Hugo Chavez's administration, and the results have been disastrous because there's so much crime in Venezuela because the country is going through not just an economic collapse, but like a complete destruction of its social fabric. That every urban center in Venezuela, like Caracas, Maracaibo, Maracay, and Valencia, are some of like the most dangerous cities on the planet. So not only you have to put up with a tyrannical government, but you have to put up with tons of criminals and other paramilitary entities that don't care about the gun laws. They buy all their guns off the black market, while law abiding citizens are just standing there like sitting ducks, um, and getting picked off by all those other nasty criminal or governmental elements. And you are seeing some people in the countryside taking up arms and just completely disobeying the gun control laws. But this is an example of how gun rights are a pretty good insurance against mayhem and potential tyranny, because it's better to have a gun and not need it than to not have it and like desperately need it, like in the case of Venezuela.
So, I mean, how big is the gun black market in Venezuela?
That I don't know in terms of numbers, but the criminal classes in Venezuela are huge. In fact, Venezuelans actually break into prisons these days because they're more secure than being out in the streets, and there's actual work and stuff like that. They're controlled by these prison chieftains called pranes, and the criminal class in Venezuela is very extensive and is like a huge power player in the country now that like a lot of like law and order has broken down and socialism has like completely collapsed all of civic society and the economy in the country. So there's a big black market, as well as a lot of Colombian drug trafficking organizations and paramilitary organizations like the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, the FARC, and the ELN, um, have all hopped across the border because Venezuela is kind of like a safe haven for them and have wreaked havoc. So there's tons of guns and drugs flowing in the country, and a lot of the citizens are helpless to fight against this crime wave and also the government tyranny because they're frankly disarmed.
Prison chieftains, it kind of sounds like warlords. Is there any similarity there?
Yeah, those are they're quasi warlords. Um, what Venezuela is going through, I've tell a lot of people, it's kind of reverting back to its primitive state throughout the 19th century, where there was just tons of demagoguery, warlord rule, and just like really like a total breakdown of order. And I think it's reverting back to that state and just descending into like more of a failed society, not just like a failed state, but a complete failed society where even like the most basic of like human practices, like the respect for private property, um, peaceful conflict resolution, it's just not on the menu any longer. It's completely turned into like a Mad Max environment.
So how bad is it for the average Venezuelan? It sounds like an apocalyptic society right now.
I mean, it is, and if you look at the numbers, like nearly 3 million Venezuelan people have left the country. So yeah, you have to put up with hyperinflation, which completely destroys your your savings. Most Venezuelans see their wealth destroyed in a matter of days now because of how bad the hyperinflation is. You can't even get basic goods because of the price controls and exchange controls that don't allow a rational pricing system in the market, and the lack of dollars makes it very difficult to import stuff. So you have massive shortages everywhere. And there's like an expression in Venezuela that is paraphrased like this: in Venezuela, you don't live, you survive.
Yeah, so it sounds like their biggest export right now is actual refugees. Where are these economic refugees going?
You will see them go predominantly to the neighboring country of Colombia. A lot of Venezuelans are of Colombian descent. Um, they'll go to Panama, United States, Spain, Portugal, Italy, especially the Venezuelans of Spanish and Portuguese and Italian descent will take advantage of those countries' citizenship policies that allow for like grandparents um, to bestow citizenship rights to their grandchildren. So they take advantage of that to get really fast citizenship and get out. Most Venezuelans are immigrants, so they have that option. But though this trend is relatively unprecedented because Venezuelans on average never really lived abroad until like the late 2000s.
So what's the attitude of the other Latin American countries right now? Are they getting fed up with the refugee crisis?
Well, Colombia, absolutely, because they've had to ask for visas, and I think Panama has also demanded visas from Venezuelans because they they simply can't handle the flow of Venezuelans coming in, and it's understandable because I think the crisis gets worse, and also if there's a potential intervention, that's only going to magnify it and displace people. So they've had to really reconsider what they have to do in order to contain what's going on in Venezuela, and that's also why Bolton and them considered sending troops over to Colombia because that's going to be one of the strategic and logistical partners for a potential like invasion because they have to like secure the border and all that there to stem the flow of people coming in and coming out.
So we're running at around 40 minutes right now. I'm going to ask you one last question, and it's kind of an open question. What do you think the percentage of regime change in Venezuela takes place? Do you think it's like a high percentage? Do you think it's a low percentage? Do you think that the threats have been enough right now where the Trump administration has to make a move to save face? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that regime change right now, like, are you referring to like a military intervention by the
A
U.S.?
military, a coup d'état of some sort.
Um,
That's
hmm,
U.S. backed and supported.
that it's gonna be Well, it's gonna be hard to say because there's just so much unrest and there's so many confounding factors in Venezuela that it's hard to say if like the U.S. was ultimately like the main catalyst behind a coup or not. But the chances of Maduro leaving, I think, are pretty high because his government is not only very unpopular, but even among his own factions of government, um, there's a lot of distrust. But even with Maduro leaving, Venezuela will not get out of its crisis because it has a lot of like huge structural problems, and there's more of a chance that the military will have him do a negotiated exit, and they'll have another figurehead, or they'll run some election where the candidate that wins is like a pre-approved candidate from the opposition that won't really rock the boat there. But I think Maduro will probably be out by the end of the year. Um, Now, as far as like a military intervention goes, I don't really see that happening anytime soon because there's just bigger geopolitical fish to fry, and like in the Middle East, and also Venezuela, outside of its oil, is kind of like a non-factor strategically speaking and geopolitically speaking. So I think there's going to be a lot of saber rattling, and there's probably going to be like more comprehensive sanctions, though.
Well, I hope there's not an intervention from the U.S. I just think it's going to make it worse in the long run. Like, even if an economy sucks, I don't want to use force to change it because, I mean, most of the times we just make things worse. But Jose, where can we find your work? Like, where are you writing at right now? I know you mentioned you're releasing a new ebook soon. Tell us when the ebook's being released and where else we could find your writing.
Well, the date on that hasn't been settled yet. It's probably going to be around March or April. Um, I'm mostly on Twitter these days with my Twitter handle at Jose Aldino. That's where you can find me. I'll be launching a website soon, but the details on that are still under wraps, and I'm still getting some housekeeping stuff in order. But Twitter is the best place to find me.
Hey, Jose.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, can you
Yeah.
hear me? Sorry,
Yeah.
I thought you cut out.
No.
That's awesome, and I'm really excited for the book, for the ebook. Like, you're doing a great job with all the articles that you released on Venezuela. It's been really, really helpful for me to catch up on everything because, like I said before, I really know next to nothing about South America or the economic crisis in Venezuela. I really know like the headline from National Review and stuff like that, and that's where my knowledge kind of drops. But thanks for agreeing to do this, man. I really appreciate it. This is really helpful.
No, thank you, Henry, for reaching out. I really do like talking
Oh,
about
no
this
problem, man. No problem.
and sharing the knowledge.